Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for coming. Welcome to the Harvard Art Museums and tonight's opening lecture for Crossing Lines, Constructing Home, Displacement and Belonging in Contemporary Art. My name is Daniel Rosenblatt, and I'm a senior living in Pforzheimer House. I study history and literature at the college.
And my name is Yonghan Po, and I'm a senior living in Cabot House, concentrating in East Asian Studies and Social Anthropology. Daniel and I are members of the Harvard Art Museum Student Board, and we're delighted to welcome you to the museums on behalf of the student community.
Please now be sure to turn off your cell phones. And also help me warmly welcome Martha Tedeschi, the Elizabeth and John Moores Cabot Director of the Harvard Art Museums, who will introduce tonight's program.
Thank you so much, Daniel and Young Han, for that warm introduction. As members of our student board, I hope you know that you provide important arts leadership on this campus, and we're energized by your return to the museum after the summer break. You may not realize it, but we miss you when you're gone. So good evening, everyone. As most of you know, fall classes began at Harvard on Tuesday, and the museum has a different and purposeful energy since the return of Harvard and indeed Boston area students more broadly. At the Harvard Art Museums, it is our practice and our pleasure to contribute to the excitement of the first week by opening our fall special exhibitions. Tonight, I am delighted to welcome each and every one of you in this audience to the opening celebration for the exhibition Crossing Lines, Constructing Home, Displacement and Belonging in Contemporary Art. At a time when the world is struggling to understand how to cope with massive displacement and the complicated notion of belonging, I want to take a moment to appreciate our local communities, to celebrate this chance to be together, and to reiterate our commitment as a museum to warm welcome for all people. I have a wonderful job because it's my job to thank the enlightened supporters of the Harvard Art Museums, donors who have helped to make the current exhibition possible. Ambitious endeavors like this one require support for many critical facets of a concept, ranging from new acquisitions and technology infrastructure to programming and outreach. We are immensely grateful for our constellation of generous support, which includes the Rosenblatt Fund for Postwar American Art, the Agnes Gund Fund for Modern and Contemporary Art, the John R. and Barbara Robinson Fund for Photography, and the Emily Rauh Pulitzer and Joseph Pulitzer Jr. Fund for Modern and Contemporary Art. Additionally, programming for this exhibition is generously supported by the M. Victor Leventritt Lecture Series Endowment Fund and the Nancy S. Nichols Memorial Lecture Fund, as well as the Richard L. Menschel Endowment Fund. I'd also like to share on this occasion our gratitude for the guidance and support the Harvard Art Museum receives all year long from the president and provost of the university, Provost Alan Garber, and Associate Provost for Arts and Culture, Lori Gross, are here with us tonight, and we're very happy to welcome them. Following tonight's lecture, we warmly invite you to join us in the Calderwood Courtyard upstairs for a reception. We're delighted to be partnering on this celebration with Fresh Start Farms, a New Hampshire-based co-op started by refugees. They have 30 farmers who grow and sell produce as part of the New American Sustainable Agriculture Program, a program of the Organization for Refugee and Immigrant Success. They bring fresh farm ingredients to our tables via neighborhood farm stands, farmers markets, community-supported agriculture, wholesale, and the Farm to School program. I've also been asked a little more less altruistically, I might say, to mention that the museum shop will be open tonight throughout the reception, and we encourage you to stop in. We actually have a fantastic little shop, and it supports every day the mission of this teaching museum, so do stop in. I'm immensely excited about the exhibition you're helping us to celebrate tonight, which features the work of a truly global community of contemporary artists, brought into dialogue with each other with incredible care and nuance by curators Makeda Best and Mary Schneider Enriquez. There are more than 40 works in the exhibition, and all but one have been drawn from the museum's permanent collections. Most are new acquisitions on view in our galleries for the first time. We are grateful to Marie Abramson, the single lender to the exhibition. We're also very grateful for the presence of a few of the artists in the exhibition at tonight's event. All of you are very welcome tonight. As the curators will explain in greater depth in a moment, the exhibition provides a departure from accepted notions of boundaries and what characterizes the migrant or refugee experience. It explores how cultures can persist and be embraced despite displacement, and how passage can be both a space of trauma and of transformation. We hope this exhibition will open new ways of understanding the immigrant experience. Tonight's program will bring the exhibition's curators to the podium first for an overview of the exhibition and its themes. They will then be joined on stage by two distinguished colleagues to be introduced shortly from other museums who are thinking about many of the same issues. So our curatorial team is Dr. Makeda Best, our Richard Menschel Curator of Photography. She oversees the museum's extensive photography collections. Her scholarly focus is on the 19th and 20th century American photography primarily, with a special interest in photojournalism, documentary and war photography, and text and image works. Dr. Mary Schneider Enriquez is our Houghton Associate Curator of Modern and Contemporary Art. Mary oversees the Harvard Art Museum's collections of modern and contemporary art. Her scholarly interests focus on 20th and 21st century global art, with special emphasis on art from Latin America, art and politics, sculpture and installation, and the work of Mark Rothko. Please join me now in welcoming and congratulating Mary and Makeda.
Thank you, Martha, and welcome all of you. This has been a project that the two of us have shared with great enthusiasm and some wonderful challenges that we hope you will find thought-provoking and stimulating. This exhibition came to life over the course of a year, which for those of you who know the way museum calendars work, that's a really short time span. But it spoke to what we are living today, and we all know we're living today. And we felt the urgency of that in our work. And in fact, making this exhibition, as Martha just pointed out of our collection was really important as a teaching museum so that these objects are not only upstairs now, but will continue to be a part of our museum for students to use now and for the years to come. So what are the facts that lead this to be such an urgent issue for us to create an exhibition about? In 2015, the displaced people worldwide reached a historic, at that point, 65 million people. And that was the most ever recorded in the 50-year history of tracking that number. Yet 3 years later, the UN High Commissioner for Refugees tells us that that number of forcibly displaced people has now reached almost 71 million people in this very short amount of time. The reality of that is something incomprehensible. Yet we hear daily in the newspaper or on the news or in social media about the issues of building walls and trying to stop this movement. So we started thinking about how do we think about immigration, how do we put it into a context, and how do we use global contemporary art for us to see the means of expression to deal with some of the issues related to this kind of immigration. Millions of people are stateless. They have been denied nationalities. They have no access to education, to healthcare, to employment, and certainly not to freedom of movement. And we know from the intense political debate that we see, as I say, in the press and the media focuses upon it, that this has led to a whole series of issues being a constant topic. What is the meaning of nationhood? What is culture about, and what is citizenship when you're forced to move? How do we define human rights today? and how should we define human rights today, and the legal and fiscal responsibilities of a nation state. And finally, what are the ethics of national and regional efforts at the control of refugees, especially when you look into the historical context of this as well, which is immigration and the issues of refugee crises is happening today, but this immigration has occurred over centuries in various countries and cultures in the world, and yet something has grown out of that. It is not all and only a crisis. And that kind of complication is what Makeda and I wanted to make a part of this exhibition upstairs. We wanted to make layering of this into something that you see. History has led to cultures interacting, and that interweaving of cultures has produced things that we can learn from, just as we hope these artists upstairs will show us. The idea of hybrid identities, the idea of creating community and curating home, when it is a foreign country, when home is a foreign place, the idea of how do you create and construct your identity when it is foreign, and the risks and challenges are immense. And what kind of identities emerge from this kind of cross-fertilization, and the complicatedness, both in terms of the human toll and the reality for those living there and in this world. These are some and few of the issues that we go through, and as Martha pointed out, we have organized this exhibition into 4 areas or topics. One is borders and passages, a second is departures, a third is constructions of home, and the fourth is causes and consequences. You can go through the exhibition one of 2 ways, either way, both doesn't matter. The point is, these themes help guide you through the expressions these artists show, and we will talk more about.
This exhibition of contemporary art is in dialogue with the work being done by our colleagues throughout the museum. In our European galleries, you'll find a 17th century silver vessel crafted by immigrant craftsmen who mixed and borrowed motifs popular across Europe at the time. In our Asian and Mediterranean galleries, you'll find a plate created by an Iranian artist in the 16th century. Forcibly displaced, he ended up in Istanbul, where he rose to great prominence as a court artist known for his floral designs. And in the Wenzel Homer exhibition, you'll find a photograph of a formerly enslaved person, just one of hundreds of thousands who fled the South in search of freedom during the Civil War. Crossing Lines also built on a previous contemporary art exhibition at the Harvard Art Museums, a monographic exhibition on the Colombian artist Doris Salcedo, for whom issues of displacement are central. Tonight, we want to reflect on what it means to curate exhibitions about global issues and conflicts. How has this moment challenged our curatorial practice? What has it forced us to confront? What new relations has it revealed to us? What cultural models and binaries have been shattered? To engage this discussion, we've invited 2 guests, Jessica Hong and Smooth Nzewi. Jessica Hong is currently the Associate Curator of Global Contemporary Art at the Hood Museum at the Museum of Art at Dartmouth College, the first to fulfill this position in the newly expanded museum. Before joining the Hood, Hong was an assistant curator at the Institute of Contemporary Art in Boston, where she organized exhibitions including Author Jaffa, Love is the Message is Death of 2018, and the ICA's presentation of We Wanted a Revolution, Black Radical Women, 1965 to 1985 in 2018. Smooth Nzewi is an artist, an art historian, and the Stephen and Lisa Tananbaum Curator in the Department of Painting and Sculpture at the Museum of Modern Art in New York. He was formerly curator of African art at the Cleveland Museum of Art, as well as at Dartmouth College's Hood Museum of Art. As an artist, he has participated in international artist residencies and workshops in Africa, Europe, and the United States. He has exhibited internationally and is represented in public and private collections, including the Smithsonian National Museum of African Art in Washington and the Newark Museum in Newark, New Jersey. Please join us in welcoming Smooth and Jessica to the conversation.
Well, I thought we'd start our conversation. Can you hear me? Mostly? Okay. I know my voice carries, but We've had some back and forth in creating this exhibition, and the four of us have talked about this a little bit already. One of the real challenges is to really look at global contemporary art in a way in which you are representing, but at the same time telling the story. And within a teaching museum, it allows us many wonderful opportunities. But I want to start at the very beginning, because you're both global contemporary, or both global contemporary curators. This is what this exhibition tries to capture as we focus on immigration. And I'm wondering if we could talk a little bit about what your sense of global is, because part of what's happened in our world is we are able to communicate all over the place much more easily, whether it's the internet, but or in other ways. There are exhibitions everywhere, curators who are world curators, etc. There are art fairs that sell art everywhere. There's Documenter, there are biennials. So I guess what I'm asking is, if we think about global in both of your context, and we, in our interactions, I know we talked about the construct of global as something that, Jessica, you mentioned was something you thought was part of, in fact, your actual words, which I found really compelling, and I know we did a kind of interactive discussion of this, was you've been interested in the idea, and it's an interesting critical journey for you, because your exact position, you are the first global contemporary curator at the Hood, and you see this as a arguably Western construct. It's a problematic idea of the world as a unified whole, which I believe I completely agree with as we think about how to bring art in and teach with it and that perspective. And Smooth, your comment to me when we were further taking Jessica's statement was one of global has both its limitations and its usefulness. And the work of certain of the artists you both are going to show us help explain that further. So we set up this kind of, how do we think about global? And Makeda, I haven't even asked you to define your term a bit, but you and I talk a lot, so I hope we'll get that too. But I set that out, and I'd love you to comment and give your perspective, and maybe start with you, Jessica, because I started with that Western perspective, please.
So I joined the Hood Museum in January as their first curator of global contemporary art, and I think that I often find that museums, when they use these terms, these very lofty terms such as global, even terms such as equity, diversity, accessibility, and inclusion, these are terms that are all well-intentioned, but are not either defined or not fully understood. And I don't necessarily want to start from a place of optimism, but one of criticality, which could encompass optimism as well. So when I entered this position, I'm still trying to kind of understand what my position actually means. I oftentimes first get what does global contemporary mean, and I still don't have a constructive answer to kind of sum up this very kind of burgeoning and ambiguous field in about a sentence or two. But kind of going to this idea of the global, I mean, it started from a problematic place. Again, this idea of a unified whole. The world is a unified whole when it's not experienced as such. But I agree with Smooth that it is a useful kind of understanding, or at least a framework and a jumping off point to kind of explore the varying contexts, that inhabit the global. And it's not necessarily just geographical. We have to think about cultural context, geographical context, but what else does the global kind of encompass and inhabit? I try to explain that my role is one of ambiguity, that there is not one kind of fixed answer, but it's something that we're always kind of exploring together. And I really do see my role as being inherently collaborative, especially at being in a teaching institution. I have this incredible access to so much knowledge just on campus, but also beyond. I also have the privilege to be able to be mobile as well. This role kind of allows me to explore beyond the bounds of the Upper Valley in New Hampshire. But I also take that with a kind of responsibility at the same time, that there is a kind of privilege to be able to move freely with the resources that institutions such as the Ivy League institutions often have. So these are all kind of things that I'm thinking about when I'm inhabiting this role, and also understanding that I'm also very honest about the fact that I can't do everything at once. I can't holistically kind of represent the globe singularly And I don't think that one institution can really do so as well. So kind of starting with that as kind of a starting point is an interesting kind of ways to have further conversations using that as a platform. And so with acquisitions, with exhibitions, but also collaborations, with artists and other cultural producers, whether they're in my community or beyond, are some ways to kind of explore that.
But I have a couple of questions for you, but I want Smooth, please, if you would mind to add your perspective on this.
Yeah, can you hear me? Yeah, I think I said the concept of the global is very useful. It has its limitations, but it also has its usefulness. I mean, I work primarily I work with artists who are often described as global artists, meaning artists who are who are non-Western artists, but who have a cosmopolitan consciousness. So the byword for the global becomes an artist whose work fits within a set of aesthetics or mode of producing art that tend to align with what is deemed digestible in the Western context, But that does not necessarily mean that there's something wrong with the work, because there's a level of conviction that these artists invest in what they make, And I give myself, I can use myself as an example. I'm an immigrant. I'm Nigerian, and I tend to think of every person with a colonial legacy as a global person, because your reality is already bifurcated. You not only see the world from your immediate space. You tend to have, you're trained to think of yourself beyond the immediate. You're trained to think of yourself as someone in the world. You don't necessarily have the sense of you will change the world, which typically is what the American kids are trained to believe. I can change the world. You are trained to believe that you are part of the world. So there's an openness that you bring with you to the world. And I think a lot of artists who are from other parts of the world, who are often described in that context, are artists whose way of thinking lend them to a certain kind of openness. Now, the other thing that I think I find very useful in the Western context is the idea of thinking of museums as global institutions, again, which I find a little bit arrogant. I've worked for two encyclopedic institutions, the Hood, where I was the curator of African art, but also moonlighting as a curator of global contemporary before I became official with Jessica. And institutions, because they represent different geographies of the world, there's a sense to which they think they are global. For that reason, you can see there's Asian collection, there's African collection, there's European collection. And so there's that sense that they think, oh, we are global because we represent the different cultures. But the reality is that the way the art of these geographies are mediated is not global. It comes from a very specific position, which is often colonial in the past. But that has since shifted. And I've had that similar experience in Cleveland, where the museum thinks of itself as very global, but then you often see that there's some kind of provincialism that comes with the way they approach the mediation of art, And in that sense, I think there's a certain lack of understanding among institutions of what it means to be global. When you're global, you have to give equal attention to different parts of the world. You don't have to privilege one culture above the other, which is not the case. So, for example, a very clear example is whenever there's an exhibition of Impressionism, the museums would tend to put more attention to that, or European artists, even when they make claims to being very global, the lack of understanding of the coevalness of the world is often something that I find quite fascinating as someone who comes from elsewhere. And what I've tried to do in my work in the institution, the formal museum institution, and outside of the museum institution is to offer that sense of openness that's part of my colonial legacy, which allows you to be open and amenable to experiences from elsewhere without trying to privilege one above the other, and helping my audience understand where every single culture fits within the community of cultures in the world.
Yeah, and actually, and to your point about institutions and museums kind of having this misunderstanding of what it is to be global, oftentimes too, when they are celebrating themselves as being global and representing cultures that are often not represented within institutional spaces traditionally, outside of the Western canon, North America and Western Europe more broadly, it's still exhibited or presented in a way that we're celebrating marginal voices, but kind of keeping a kind of marginalization of these regions that are not often represented. And so it's kind of, we're in the stasis of being unable to kind of break these binaries that exist, I think, within the global. The global, oftentimes, a lot of the responses, the reactions that I've actually received when I tell people my title without any prompting is, oh, you're the curator do you focus on Africa and Asia? Or is this, so you're a non-Western curator? And so kind of this exclusion of realms, people already have this projection of what the global means to them. And so that's actually been a really interesting experience about how although I don't necessarily have an explicit description of what the global contemporary means to me, it seems that everyone has this kind of particular understanding whether it's through their educational training, and looking within these kind of colonial sites of historical institutions, that this is the understanding of what it is to be global. So in the last few months, a lot of it has been trying to kind of break down the original, kind of these initial understandings to, as you said, to kind of have a more openness, and again, kind of be in this space of ambiguity with me, as opposed to having this kind of this and, like this is this and this is this, these kind of neat pockets.
One of the things that you said when we were walking around, Jessica, was interesting, which is that institutions often curate global with works that they don't own, right? It's always like, we're gonna borrow works to tell that story and then collect the same things we always collect.
Yeah.
And that's another kind of distinction of the way in which global is treated, not with art that you actually are collecting.
Yeah, absolutely, that these are temporary kind of experiences. Institutionally, this may not be publicly obvious, but oftentimes, institutions very much focus on temporary special exhibitions with large loans from other institutions, and then permanent collection exhibitions are kind of these, were thought of very easy, slapdash exhibitions, but the curatorial framing is still very much the same labor. We're being as thoughtful, as intellectually rigorous, and again, the labor is very much the same, but the resources are given to this kind of temporary moment. But what is permanent is the collection here, and especially at a teaching institution, these are the artworks that we're actually teaching with. And so I think that there needs to be this kind of intersection or integration of the resources that are given. And I think if we're collecting for the collection, we are making a serious commitment to these artists and these artworks and the narratives that these objects are telling, and that it will continue to kind of live on and be recontextualized. So I really appreciated that with this incredibly difficult topic, both timely and timeless, that it was all kind of organized with the permanent collection.
But you can also make a case with the recent reopening of the Hood. Because I did the Global Contemporary Gallery, but I say Global Contemporary Africa Focus. And the idea is to say that every geography is global and contemporary.
Yep.
So you can focus on, say, Africa, looking at it within the concept of global contemporary, which is really, it's become an art world, buzzword, word, that has a very pertinent currency.
Yeah.
That this is an artist who operate, who think of themselves as both local and global at the same time. And so at the Hood, what we were able to achieve at the Hood was to sort of focus on Africa. You can also, the next installment might just focus on Asia. The next installment might focus on Latin America. Focus on artists whose work embody a set of practice that one can identify, even when the language, the subject matter is different, but there's some kind of understanding of what the artist is trying to say, And so you can do that with different geographies, and that of the Hood all comes from the collection.
Yeah, exactly. No, precisely. So this is all to toot my own horn at the Hood, but I think that's Smooth. But Smoothie, I'd love to hear you talk about this. What I also really found interesting at the Hood as well is that there's no fixed galleries. So there's no culturally specific galleries, and there's no actually distinction between permanent collection exhibition spaces as well as special exhibition spaces. So there's no privileging of particular sites, which I actually thought was really interesting. So I don't know, I'm sure you were part of those initial conversations as well, and the kind of intention behind that.
Yeah, I think one of the things I enjoyed when I was working in the teaching museum is there's a level of transparency and attention to discourse that you don't necessarily find in the more public-facing museums. The reason being that you're engaged with quote-unquote intellectual community, and so you don't need to very often water down what you're trying to say, and that you're also able to address more difficult issues that a lot of more public museums might run into trouble if they do not handle those topics very well, And so I enjoyed the cover or shelter that teaching museums provided one to be able to deal with all manners of subjects, which is different from my last institution and my current institution, where you have to always think about how to make whatever you present more accessible, So there's an attempt to also find the familiar all the time, because you are dealing with your audience, for example, So in Cleveland, there's the Cleveland audience. So whenever you're making a show, one of the things that always come up is how will our audience respond to this exhibition, And then I often make the case that you don't have to speak for your audience all the time. But over time, you realize that a lot of marketing goes into all of that. The museum would go out and do polls and sort of try to get information from the audience, So, and then they tell all their exhibitions to the audience, which is also very problematic because you feed the audience what you expect them to.
Expanding it.
Rather than expanding that, which the teaching museum, the safe cover of the teaching museum allows you to do all manner of things and get away with that,
That's our hope.
I think,
Do you mind if we ask you how you approach this idea of the global with this exhibition?
Well, I think it's a great question, because one of the things I was thinking listening to both of you was, one of our tasks has been really to try to represent more of the people who come through our doors as we think about acquisitions and think about who are the incredible talents who haven't been recognized before in our collection on some level. And this exhibition, I think, allowed us an opportunity to really dive into that issue in a way in which I love your explanation of, or thinking about having been trained in Latin American art history, this idea of the hierarchy and the expansiveness is something that I've always looked at in a way unlike what I was trained to think when I first started art history. And my point being, responding to an artist from other cultures who hasn't been included before, who I want people to dive in and just think about, is something that I think is a real priority for us. But also speaking to the historic collections, branching off from breaking with tradition, that's all exactly what we want as well. But there's no one answer, but I think as we thought about what we were collecting for the show, at least my perspective, and we talked about a lot of this constantly, was who can speak to the issues we want to address in the exhibition, but who can also show us the incredible talent and the vision of these creators from cultures and perspectives we've not had in our museum before, so that we're looking at this from various angles all at once, and it's a case-by-case basis. I mean, it is very tough to decide because there's so many people that really deserve more attention than they've received so far. And there's only so many funds, but we basically were in dialogue about who we had in photography and who we could add in photography and who in objects, whether sculpture, film, prints, whatever. And it was really fitting with so many criterion. There's no one answer would be my way of addressing it. I don't know.
But we were very conscious of how we could bring back stories that had been told at one time in a different context, and how we could return to those stories and give them a new context with this exhibition. People who were speaking about migration or displacement in various forms, but in this context, you understand that story in a new way. We brought back works that we never before exhibited. Works, for example, about Native American, the displacement of Native Americans, essentially, put those works in this context. I think that in photography, it's somewhat different. I think I was, when I was educated, I got my PhD, I benefited from a generation of scholars who really understood photography as really a history of global networks and of trading and of sharing. I mean, photography, that is its history. It really is something in which you can't really say there is one place did it. I mean, every place is doing it in different ways, and I think that's always been a part of the history, but it's only recently been acknowledged and celebrated more and investigated more on what those kind of networks and discussions were. And I think that this show in many ways represents that. We have many different photographers from around the world working on various stories, demonstrating the difficulties of pigeonholing photography, because there's so many stories, you're always aware that you're not telling a story. So you never think that the story is done, because you're always aware that's just one person's vision. So I think it is unique as a curator of time-based art to to think about this question, because you always know there's a story you're missing.
I think we're always aware too of to that point of what we're missing. There's always more we need and we want, and that's exciting but also challenging. And you both must face that all the time. I mean,
and also going back to the singular perspective of the photographer, I also often think about the singular perspective of the curator as well, and that that's a kind of a complicated position to be in. There is a responsibility that comes with that kind of authorship and visibility. But that's why I do see my role as one that is inherently collaborative. I mean, even within the museum institution, we can't do the works alone. We have an install team, we have a registration team, we have fellows, and then of course we connect with different colleagues, and it's not just me as a singular author of an exhibition. There's a lot of voices that are participating in the kind of the final manifestation of this, thought process. But trying to render those more visible, I think, is something that I'm also thinking about. If we talk about global perspectives, how can one inhabit, manifest these global perspectives through a singular voice? So trying to kind of broaden that, again, going back to the openness, that Smooth, talked about so beautifully as well.
Or transparency, perhaps. It's also about being transparent about the effort of curating and sort of making that mark on the wall in the space, an effort of showing that deliberate arrangement. I think in photography, I've gotten away from, or I've always embraced a curatorial practice of not a line on the wall, but a line that's always uneven, something that's always askew, so that that it is my choice to do that. So that becomes a kind of way of speaking to the fact that this is a labor, this is a collection that is on the wall, and it's a collection that is being built by a person. I mean, you've spoken about the legacy of your position, and my own position was created by a curator who had worked at MoMA under Edward Steichen, and he really had a vision of photography as something that could, a collection of photography and a collection of photographs on the wall as something that could speak about broad human conditions. I mean, there were lots of problems with that, but it's a useful idea to think about the act of collecting, as we've done in this exhibition. We've made very particular choices about things that we've collected, and those are statements. And so, as well as the arrangement that we've put together is a statement in and of itself. But perhaps we'd like to kind of familiarize the audience with your work as well. So we have a few of images that you've offered us to share, and we'd just like you to take a moment to share with us your own kind of curatorial work and the way in which these issues impact it.
Your vision and context with examples.
So again, I've only been at the Hood since January, and I've made a few acquisitions, so going back to kind of the permanent collection and what works we actually make permanent. So I recently acquired this work by Ho Tzu Yen. I saw this work while I was in Hong Kong. It's called The Critical Dictionary of Southeast Asia. And also thinking about kind of the global, not just in the regional or geographical sense, but kind of also with media. So the Hood, I'm slowly kind of understanding the Hood's collection, and one way, to really kind of strengthen a collection is to kind of look at where perhaps some of the gaps are, and at least with media, the Hood is a little bit lacking in time-based media. And so I kind of made a particular priority in the first year to really focus on time-based media. So I saw this work in Hong Kong, and it's an incredibly engrossing, captivating, at times uncomfortable film. It's a filmic installation. But the work itself is actually, the artist considers is the algorithm and the database that is running this, this film. So it started with this question of, what unifies this region of Southeast Asia that actually it encompasses different politics, religions, ideologies, and cultures. So the term Southeast Asia is actually a colonial term. It was coined by the Allied forces in World War II because they had an outpost in the region, and they just needed an easy term to kind of classify this big landmass, and it obviously has stuck. And so the term Southeast Asia, it assumes the positioning. Only if you're in the West is this region south and east. And again, it does not kind of classify, it doesn't capture the multiplicity of this region by any means. And so what he started to do was create this dictionary of terms using the English-Latin alphabet from A to Z that is meant to kind of classify this region of Southeast Asia. And so he worked with some software programmers in Berlin to create this algorithm in which it culls all of this audiovisual material that Ho Tzu Yen actually collects himself, manually tags, and then feeds them into this algorithm. And then what you're experiencing then is the filmic manifestation of this algorithm. But he continuously adds to this algorithm and database, so you're never actually going to see the same film twice. And so it's technically considered an infinite film. And also it becomes it's not, and so the specific use of the English language alphabet is a very intentional one. So he grew up in Singapore, where he spoke Cantonese at home, but all of his schooling was in English. And so he kind of he speaks about this colonializing of language, and which is why he used kind of the English alphabet for this critical dictionary. And it's also a satirical exercise because he actually doesn't he doesn't think that he can actually create a full dictionary that encapsulates all of Southeast Asia. I hope to exhibit this soon. So there's, I guess, I'll talk about these two different works. Stephanie Saijuko is a really wonderful artist. She kind of came onto the scene with in the new photography show in 2018, and actually has work on view right now at the ICA in the Less is a Bore exhibition. But I met Stephanie earlier this year, and much of her works, which is photography but also installation, kind of addresses the disputed ground of identity, citizenship, nationality, as well as the legacies of colonialism, and of course speaks to a lot of the themes in the exhibition itself. And so this is a series that came from her Cargo Cults project, which looked at kind of the history of ethnographic photography. And a lot of these images that you'll see here, there's no story or narrative that's given to you or provided to you, and so oftentimes viewers are making these assumptions about the sitters themselves, but it's actually the photographer, it's Stephanie herself, the artist, that is wrapped in what looks like these exotic fabrics, but are just purchased from kind of fast fashion stores such as Target and Urban Outfitters, and then taken on her phone. So this is from her Applicant Photos Migrant series, and they're actually, the scale of it is diminutive. It's the size of a passport photograph. And so, this series in particular kind of really speaks to the issues of migration, not just in the contemporary sense, but kind of, more broadly, touching upon more global issues of how oftentimes when we speak of migration, it's always in this kind of, this tone of trauma and crisis. And oftentimes these groups that are, moving are described kind of en masse, these anonymous kind of hordes that are, coming to the border. So trying to both speak to the visibility, but invisibility, but also kind of giving visibility to these narratives. And so Shannon Te'au is an artist that is from New Zealand. He's of Maori heritage and ancestry. And I was really interested in his work, personally for a very long time. But when I came to Dartmouth, I thought this was a really important conversation to have with this work. I don't know if you know the history of Dartmouth much. I'm still kind of learning, the storied and history of the college. But it was founded in the mid-1760s, so a colonial institution. And it was founded by a minister, Eliezer Wheelock, who actually wanted the college to be a school for indigenous students for them to become missionaries. And then after, I'm still kind of understanding the trajectory of it, but it didn't actually become a school for indigenous students, and it really just then became a school for Anglo-American men. And it had been that way for about 200 years. And so these issues of indigeneity, the fraught kind of relationship between indigenous communities in this region is a long and complicated kind of narrative. And so my colleague, my new colleague, she's the curator of Native American art and from the Osage Nation. She and I, in the past few months that I've been there, have really kind of been diving into issues of indigeneity, kind of on a more global scale. And so Shannon Te'au, a lot of his work implements Maori traditions as a jumping off point and explores these kind of fraught dynamics between indigeneity, language, and loss. And so this is a really beautiful film that I saw. It's actually, the starting point is a scene from Charles Burnett's kind of iconic 1978 film, Killer of Sheep, where the two figures, Stan and his wife, they're at this critical juncture in their relationship, and they're slow dancing to Dinah Washington's The Bitter Earth. But you can see that through kind of their life experiences, the relationship had kind of been lost from what it had been. And so in the film, you see these two figures kind of dancing slowly together to an a cappella version of a Maori translated The Bitter Earth. And it's seemingly intimate, but there's this, if you're really watching closely, there's this tension, between the two, and you're not fully sure kind of what the relationship is. And there's actually, it's a 2-channel film, and it's projected on one screen on either side. So you're actually never able to see the entire film in full. And so you're almost experiencing that kind of loss as well. And so, thinking about works to enter into the collection, in addition to kind of thinking, again, more globally and more openly, perhaps, I'm also thinking about the context of where I am situated at the same time. I think that there's a lot of histories that Dartmouth has yet to contend with, and also museum institutions have yet to contend with, and I see a lot of these works as ways to kind of bring those narratives and histories, to the fore in order to actually contend with kind of what came before.
All right. So I'm going to show the works of 4 artists that I've worked with for a number of years. And the criteria for my selection are artists who were born elsewhere and live elsewhere, either in Africa but working elsewhere. And also artists whose work engage with the idea of displacement and trauma. And so the first work is the first work is by Halida Boukourié. She's a French artist of Algerian descent. So she actually identifies as Algerian, but she was born in France. And the reason being that the space in which not French citizens of North African descent occupy in France is a very unstable place, you know. And so what she's done, she's a photographer, what she's done over the years is really to work within her community. So she engages, she's a photographer but also a performance artist. She engages with immigrants or first generation French kids who share the similar kind of what I call the not just immigrant experience, but also immigrant aesthetics. And this is from the series, her Pandora series, where she examines what it means to be a citizen in the typical old French idea of the Republic, and how immigrants or first generation French citizens are often, that promises of the Republic is not, the promises are not extended to them. And so what you have here are West African French citizens, French kids of West African descent who hold on to those promises and know their access to success or economic mobility is either through soccer or through education. You know, you see that in almost every single immigrant community, even in the United States. That if you want to be successful, it's either you go through sports or you buckle down and study. You know, and so she typically her aesthetic is really drawing from sort of the Baroque style, the Flemish approach to framing, and she's really studied that and she's made it as her visual language, and I find this very rich. Initially, I organized an exhibition for a gallery in New York in 2015, and the title of the show was "Guess Who's Coming to Dinner" from the old movie, the Sydney Poitier movie, and it was really about discussing the absence of. So it showed a number of African artists who were successful elsewhere, but not in the United States, and typically there's a sense to which. New York thinks of itself as the center of the art world. Yes. And the idea was, if these artists are successful and they are known in New York, what makes New York the center of the art world, basically, you know? Great point. And so it was important to use Sidney Poitier's film as sort of, because people are quite familiar with that film, and to say that these are African artists who are quite visible elsewhere, they are coming to dinner in the United States. And she was one of the artists that I showed because she straddles the African, the Arab, and the French world, and she's been very successful in the way she addresses those issues. So this is a piece from that series, and ultimately it was collected by The Hood. You know, I collected it for The Hood, and it was part of the show I did at the Hood Museum in 2015. Yunus Baba Ali is a sound and video artist from Morocco. Who currently lives he lives actually between Brussels and Casablanca, and this is a series it did where he focused on African immigrants in Naples, and the emphasis here is really the way in which this immigrants try to stake a claim of citizenship in Italy, and so they try to advertise that claim by wearing clothing that show patriotism in that sense, you know. And so you will see that with this guy who's probably of North African descent, who's wearing, it says Italiano, and then the other guy. Let's see how what's the pointer now?
I don't know.
Oh, sorry.
No worries.
Sorry, I've written this.
Oh, wait.
Molly will help.
Oh, that's okay.
I know, Bridget.
All right, how do you get this to where it was before?
No, don't put it back on.
She'll fix it.
She'll get it back on.
So it's really about how the immigrant tries to successfully emplace oneself in an environment where in an environment where he or she's often seen as a threat, and this is really the emphasis of this work by Eunice. And then the other artist is an artist that I mean we've really come a long way. We were in art school together in Nigeria, and my last show at the Cleveland Museum of Art was actually focused on this artist. So in 2015, the artist was invited to Berlin to participate in the DAAD fellowship, and one of the things that struck him while he was in Berlin was the process or the way in which African immigrants move from Africa to Europe, and the countries that they find very attractive. And he decided to approach that through food. He's an artist who's primarily a sound artist, but he's also he also makes beer, and then he's also a cook. So his practice embodies gastronomy, beer, and all of that, including sound. And all of that are in the space. It involves neon and then audio installation, which he recorded in restaurants in Berlin. And one of the things you see, I mean, it's not very clear. I don't know where the pointer is. I'm not going to point. Is on those items, you have food as ready as the neon, and then the other elements are fork and knife, and then painted in the color of the European Union, and then the fork and knives represent the different European countries where there's a major push by African immigrants too, where they hope to get economic mobility. Right. And so then what he did was to now use the French Michelin star to grade those countries that attract the most of African immigrants. And so that's what you see with those stars. It's a very evocative piece when you hear the sound. Where it says, we all go to Europe because we think of Europe as El Dorado, And it won the Butcherstraat Prize of the city of Bremen in Germany. So it's one of the artist's key works. And I think one of the things the artist said when he moved to Berlin that sort of inspired this work was how he missed the taste of home, taste being food. And then he discovered a Nigerian restaurant in Berlin, and then that restaurant, which I visited that restaurant severally. It does not only serve the Nigerian community in Berlin, but it also serves the African community. So they all moved to that restaurant in droves, and that was the inspiration for this piece actually. And then the last piece I'll show, I know a number of us will be familiar with the work of this artist, Njideka Kunyili-Crosby, who's also Nigerian, but she's based in LA. She moved to the United States when she was 16 to study medicine, and then in typical African fashion, she switched over to art. And she switched over to art, and her work is often, it's a combination of collage, photo transfers derived from Nigerian imageries, politics, fashion, ethnography, music stars from the 80s and all of that, which she combines. And then very often there's always the image of the artist and the husband, the husband is the muse for her. Always in the images, and what you find is the way she collapses time and space, but also geography. How she brings our two worlds, the American world and that of Nigeria, in one picture surface. And the title "Wantinti" is actually a very famous pop song from the 1980s by Nelly Uchendu that describes amorous relationship between a man and a woman. So the work in itself is very didactic in that sense. But what is really very key in her work is the way she fits on nostalgia and fantasy. You know, nostalgia of Nigeria because she moved to the United States very young, but also how she processes displacement. She often thinks of what she often uses Homi Bhabha's third space to describe how the reality of a Nigerianness and Americanness sort of collapsed and meet in that liminal space where she locates herself. And so she's that one artist who's been able to, whose work, people don't often read her work in that sense, but her work is heavy on the trauma of displacement, and I find her work quite moving in that sense. So yeah.
Interesting. Wow.
I lost my microphone.
Lots of change. Got it?
No, but you raised an interesting point, you know, this kind of collapsing not just of space, but of also of time, and kind of how it's not just, the global is not explicitly just the geographical, but it's also constitutes the temporal as well. And, you know, although, you know, my official kind of, my area is in contemporary art, you know, the contemporary encompasses all of these different histories. It's not just present and a prospective future, but kind of everything that had preceded it. And especially now being at an institution, it's not entirely encyclopedic, but it has a lot of, you know, historic collections. And so finding ways, I think in order to be contemporary and really in order to be global as well, you know, you need to activate these histories as well, as opposed to just kind of like letting it languish, whether it's in storage or because we don't have these focused kind of curators that are focusing on these specific temporalities, like in what ways can we activate it that will really benefit the audiences that we serve. And so I think in this kind of, in my new capacity, I'm also trying to think about ways in which we can integrate kind of our collections a bit more broadly, as opposed to only focusing on my specific kind of temporality. And even, you know, again, with the gallery spaces being flexible, there's no fixed culturally specific galleries. And so how, rather than just focusing on particular regions, like what are the productive ways in which we can actually integrate these, you know, have these cultural dialogues kind of come together. Of course, I do think that there is an importance to have these focused conversations, but I think that there also needs to be a balance.
It's interesting in your works that you're acquiring that it's also, you know, the global is local too, so you have this kind of local global story as well.
Absolutely. Yeah, exactly. Again, trying to kind of balance, you know, these narratives that are happening around the world while also kind of bringing, I mean, going back to the familiar, I think that there, you know, that gets complicated when you have these really complex themes that you want to explore with your publics, and you don't necessarily want to water it down, you know, as you say, but finding ways, even within the familiarity, that kind of, there is a productive space in which you can explore these really potent themes, and the familiarity as being kind of a starting point to enter into a lot of the thematics that some of these artists are exploring.
Well, and the global local, Mary, you want to talk about, I mean, one of our pieces upstairs really also engages that idea of the local global, the Willie Doherty installation that we have.
Yes, actually, we very deliberately have a portion of our exhibition has, in the area of causes and consequences, we have Dylan Vitone's photographs of South Boston and the kind of Irish immigrant community as it really is. And I acquired a film by Willie Doherty, a Northern Ireland artist, whose video really speaks to the history and tradition of the Troubles in Northern Ireland and how that religious divide has been a long-standing issue and goes back to the whole idea of how immigration was forced in many cases, not simply because, I mean, for various reasons, and those divides are one of them. So, and we tried to bring that home in a way that we haven't focused in this museum on the history of the Irish presence in Boston. Is so important to what Boston is, and I felt very strongly, and we worked together on this of thinking, you know, it is global local as well, and there's much that hasn't been recognized and really should be. So.
I mean, I think one of the questions that often, I wouldn't say I struggle with, but I think about a lot all the time, is which again goes back to the framing of your show, is who the immigrant is, you know. I think, and also using the terms trauma and displacement as tropes to describe the immigrant experience. It's sort of, again, I think, in my own view, I would say, it doesn't provide the full extent of the immigrant experience. Again, it tries to shoe in the experience in certain ways. So you have ideas like forcibly removed, people who move because of displacement, war, and all of that. But people move for all kinds of reasons, you know. And one of the things that one of the artists Makeda addresses in his work is even the concept of who gets the expatriate status and who gets the immigrant status. Those are two loaded terms, you know. You know, and because with the expatriate status doesn't describe forcible removal. It describes someone who's well-to-do, and in the typical flaneur of 19th century, you want to move somewhere, you move. You're well-to-do, you emplace yourself successfully, and you have an audience in your new environment, you know. And a number of artists, you find them in that category, you know. They're not all forcibly removed, you know. They address a different kind of immigrant experience that's not always the focus of our attention.
I think that in our exhibition we really tried to represent many different types of experiences. I mean, we have a series of works about Native Americans, right? I mean, how would we describe their displacement? I mean, that is bringing a story into this issue that, at least in the American context, no one ever talks about, right? This was a population that also was displaced, if you will. And then we also, I mean, in one of the key walls is a work that references the Underground Railroad. And I mean, we don't call them runaways. Like, who are those people? They weren't runaways. They were enslaved people seeking their own freedom. So we're very interested in how to think about terms and how to expand, especially the kind of preconceived notions about, or the popular notions that we have about this issue in this country, the way in which, you know, the focus is on that wall. I mean, that's all the focus is on. But as someone like Bill McDowell's photographs show us, the Canadian border looks completely different. It's not militarized, right? There's literally, you know, yellow cones and, you know, a trailer, right? So we're really trying to disrupt what people think they know about these spaces and this issue through the popular media. So I do think that we were, you know, very conscious of this. I know we were very conscious of, you know, how this issue is portrayed and how we could disrupt that. But it certainly, we didn't imagine that we would cover all experiences, and we were very uncomfortable with the fact that there are so many different types of, you know, there's internally displaced, there's migrants, there's refugees. You know, how do you deal with all those titles, and what do those titles even mean? So it was a challenge.
And I appreciate, like, your transparency about the inability to be fully kind of comprehensive in such a large, complicated, multifaceted topic. And I think that institutions, or at least that I am personally very open about the failures of kind of these prompts. And so being, again, transparent about the inability, but hopefully that, again, seeing the museum space as one of a space of ambiguity, not necessarily to give answers, but as a space for true exploration, and especially being in a teaching institution within a university setting, again, as we have that kind of safety net to be able to have these conversations. You know, we even had a really interesting conversation upstairs with some visitors while we were walking through the museum space, you know, that hopefully also kind of shifting the visitors' understanding that we're not the end all be all to knowledge. You know, we're only here as perhaps as attempting to be arbiters, but really kind of seeing the publics as part of the conversation, and that the exhibition is not the end of a particular topic. It's an attempt to try to kind of contextualize a little bit for our visitors and how artists are trying to engage in these really difficult subject matters, but that it's open-ended and it's kind of continuous. And I think that's one of the reasons why I love contemporary art as well. It's constantly shifting. Shifting in temporalities and practices and media, kind of, as well as conversations. Even the last few years, I feel like the conversations have shifted, pretty dramatically to the point where I'm also kind of catching up with what is happening in the contemporary present.
Yeah, I think back to actually both your points is we wanted to complicate the issue such that students have asked already, well, how many of your artists actually were displaced and then they created the work? Right. And we basically have, to your point, because there are many layers to this about immigration that we actually embraced in the artists we chose. But I would also say that we talked a lot about the idea that coming out of this exhibition, we hope people will be left with thoughts that it provokes thoughts in them, and they continue to think about what are these issues, what does this mean, and they may respond to one work of art, the Doho Sa walking through that, versus a picture of the wall on the border, versus, each work of art in different ways we hope will kind of pull someone in to think, and so that they leave and it lasts in their mind what they've seen, whatever part of it. And because it is so incredibly complicated over time and the nature of the artist, as your examples of artists by both of you further point out, it's really very...
I think that one, and we're probably coming to the end of our discussion here, I do think that one important point is that, and I'll go back to what I was saying before about a collection and a collection on the wall. There are works that are from our permanent collection that we've never exhibited before. Not everything is newly acquired. And I think that, part of our statement is the curatorial choices that we're making, which are not perfect, but which attempt to tell a story and to make an argument. And hopefully that discussion will continue beyond the spaces in which we have presented the works. And we thank you all for coming, but I think we need to wrap up.
Please.